Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight.
Woo!
Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh, yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work. But anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it. As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
Okay, we're going to try something new here for the Race Members Club on Patreon. You've been asked for your questions, comments and conspiracy theories to put to me about my Brazilian Grand Prix F1 driver ranking. So I'm going to work through those quickly. I've not looked at them, so I'm going to do it on the fly, which could work or could go quite badly. The race was a couple of days ago now, so there's every chance I've forgotten everything I knew and all the reasoning, but I'll give it my best shot. So first up, Chris Parrott. Ed, in the current rankings format, what has been the largest discrepancy between ranking position and finishing position that you have awarded? Do you stand by that ranking looking back on it? Outstanding that the first question I read requires me to remember all my rankings of the last 2 years. That is a good question. I'm going to have to probably look back a bit to go through that. I can think of a few cases. There are cases, obviously, the most extreme ones will be where a driver is retired and they get ranked quite well because they were going to get a good result. Leclerc in Bahrain last year springs to mind. I think he was third or fourth in my ranking, but of course he didn't finish. Sergio Perez sometimes has some of those offsets in rankings as well. Australia, I think this year maybe was quite a big offset. He was he's fifth on Australia, and I think he was in the mid-teens in my ranking. But I'll have a bit of a deeper look, and I'll get back to you on that one. Chris, okay. The next one from Steve D. This season specifically seems harder than ever to know what the baseline of competition truly is. Even the teams themselves are not always sure why they're faster or slower from one weekend to the next, and any predictability is often short-lived. Given that part of the ranking is based on how much a driver extracted out of their machinery, have you found this year especially difficult to write the rankings for? Yes, it has been tricky. There's a few reasons. The question of what the performance of the car is, the baseline performance of the car is pretty important because a key thing is, do they get 100% or how close to 100% out of the potential do they extract? If you have spec offsets, that can be a big problem because sometimes you say, okay, driver X has got the upgrade package, driver Y has got the old package, the upgrade package should be quicker, so there's an offset. But sometimes the old package could be better. You've also got the problem of the age parts. Now, there's quite a few people who are limping through to the end of the season. They've had a lot of crash damage, so they're mixing and matching a bit. There's some patched up bits and pieces. Mercedes have talked about that being a problem. They've had quite a few crashes. Williams, after what happened at the weekend, is a good example. And then you get cars like the Mercedes. That's been a nightmare to benchmark this season because it's so erratic. What ideally you want is a nice, consistent performance through the weekend where you have a reasonable idea of, say, okay, this is the fourth fastest car. But then you get Mercedes leaping forward at times and you think, well, how much is driver? How much is car? Lewis Hamilton's off on the first lap at Austin. In terms of what the team saw, the way the car was behaving, three-wheeling, the way the rear was reacting, it's very understandable that it went wrong. But still, you've got the question of, the driver made a mistake. So, it is tougher under these rules, and it has got pretty difficult this year. But you just have to take your best shot at working out what the rough ranking order of the cars is and what they can do. And that depends on what the drivers do with them. The pace you see in flashes in the weekend. But it is very, very, very difficult, especially when you've got small gaps between drivers. And, well, there's an enormous question. That's just what I need from David Tripler. This looks very thorough. Says, I promise to keep it much shorter next time. Yeah, that would be good. Now, what have we got? It's tough to put in numbers, but how do you weigh race performance compared to the rest of the weekend? Yeah, that's a good one. Also complicated by being a race weekend, a sprint race weekend. So you've got two separate parts of the weekend. Practice isn't a huge informer. For example, if you're not much good in the race and qualifying, but you look really good in practice, that's not going to help your cause. Practice does add context. Do you make some mistake in practice? If you crash, say, and you cost yourself a session, have you lost a session to something that was not your fault? That plays a part as well. And it's useful for benchmarking the pace, but qualifying and the race are key. And in a sprint weekend, the sprint elements are the kind of minority parts of that. So they do play a role. I would say, for example, this weekend, I ranked Gasly above Ocon, and that was because Gasly was quick in that Alpine in all conditions, whereas Ocon was more limited by the mid-corner understeer. They had basically the same car spec. There was no great divergence between them, but Gasly was getting the pace out of it in both sessions, in both wet and dry, rather. And of course, he was stitched up in qualifying the same way as Verstappen was, because he was basically with Verstappen. He had the same problem of Ocon going past both of them at the start of what should have been their first push lap. So that became a build lap again. And then Stroll crashed and you had the red flag. So that's why Gasly didn't make it through to Q3. How much do you factor in expectations and or experience? Yeah, that's tricky. You make the point, especially in a race like we've had, shouldn't the bar be higher for the likes of Perez, Sainz or Bottas than for Lawson, Berman or Colapinto? Yes. Experience you have to weigh in. It kind of depends what happens. Colapinto crashed under the safety car. I understand why it happened. That part of the track is very, very tricky, but it was under the safety car. Yes, he was catching the pack. That plummeted him in the rankings because it's what I'd call an inexcusable error for rankings purposes. But because of the inexperience, it's not something that I'd have him hung, drawn and quartered for example. It happens. So sometimes you get ones like that. Anything where you, like Grosjean did at Interlagos some years ago, if you hit the wall on the formation lap or you go off under the safety car, like George Russell did at Imola a few years ago, for example. Things like that tend to absolutely harpoon the rating, whatever your experience. And yes, the bar is higher. So you saw people like Sainz and Hamilton struggle a bit, but Colapinto was below them. Experienced drivers and good machinery finish at the low end of what their car is capable of and get pretty decent rankings. Yeah, that is difficult, partly because it depends on what the challenge is of the weekend in the race. Now, qualifying is pretty straightforward. You just got to go as quickly as you can over a lap, get through to Q3 ideally. In the race, sometimes it depends what your mission is, let's say, in terms of what you access. Sometimes I think of it a little bit like if you're doing a style sport in the Olympics, say, if you're doing diving or figure skating, there's a certain level of difficulty involved, but you don't get to choose it. So sometimes that's part of it. And it can be very, very difficult. I try to balance up for it. I do think it's fair to say there's probably a little bit of a bias towards those who get the good overall results. I try not to do that, but it's quite difficult not to, because sometimes you've got drivers who are driving around at the back and there's not much for you to do. If you're in a Sauber, you're pretty much going to finish at the back, and there's not a great deal you can do. So that limits the accessibility, unless you do something like Bottas has done in the last few weekends and he's finished ahead of cars. Perhaps he shouldn't do and got the car a bit higher up. As a fellow German, I probably have a bit of a pro-Hulkenberg bias, but I actually think you rated him too generously in this one. Could have been a huge opportunity for the Haas team. He had a messy weekend, deserves more criticism for that than Behrman. Yeah, a couple of things there. The Haas is quite bad in the wet. It's not working well. Not sure exactly why, whether it's the way it's firing the tyres. Same problem Ferrari maybe had. Same suspension. Could be that. Could be that obviously you get different aerodynamic effects from the wet tyres and in the conditions and the slight difference in ride heights, that kind of thing. So the Haas wasn't working. Hulkenberg obviously didn't have a brilliant weekend. He was struggling with rhythm. Behrman, difficult circumstances, pitched in without prep, so did very well. But Behrman did just go off too many times in the wet. There were far too many. That mistake early on when he caught the back of Colapinto was just a little bit clumsy and inattentive. Just got on the power and clipped the back of him. And then a number of offs. So, again, I feel sorry for him for that. But, yeah, it just happened too many times. And Hulkenberg was a bit unlucky because he had the off. Yes, he did rejoin, but he was kind of balanced. I think it was where there was a drain cover, so the rear wheels weren't attached to the ground. Hence, he got disqualification for outside assistance. Perez is too high. Yeah, you could argue that. Maybe expectations are lowered by the fact that he struggled so much. But Perez did have a very good sprint race. Gained, I think, 5 positions. So that helped him a little bit. Obviously, sprint qualifying wasn't good. Qualifying for the main race wasn't good. The main race itself wasn't good. So maybe that was a bit generous. But at least he didn't throw it at the scenery. Behind Hamilton, obviously Perez was ranked lower than Hamilton. Hamilton, I think, was just not seeming that interested over the weekend. Yeah, he was struggling, but Russell did very well, just as Verstappen did. So, yeah, Perez at least got something more out of the weekend and seemed at least to be trying a little bit harder. I think Hamilton's kind of checked out, which I completely understand. Right, next question. Adam Barton, how much do you grade on a curve based on experience, given poor races from experienced drivers like Perez and Hamilton outscored Behrman and Colapinto, who haven't driven in the wet? I assume this has no impact. Yeah, experience does play a bit of a part, particularly for those who are thrown in at the deep end. For example, Ollie Behrman was ranked number 1 for Saudi Arabia, thrown in on Saturday. Obviously, if he'd been in the car and an experienced driver and Carlos Sainz had finished 7th and not made Q3, he'd have got quite a low rating. So I do try and factor that in. I think in terms of Behrman and Colapinto, Colapinto, the magnitude of the off, as I've mentioned, the mistake under the safety car, just too much. I think regardless of experience, that tanks your rating. Behrman, just too many, unfortunately, for him. So a tough learning experience. Michael Holden says, where do you start? Do you pick who you think is the worst or best driver and use that as a baseline? I imagine you have several iterations of this. Do you ever find significant changes between the initial draft and final selection? And can you think of an example? Well, the process I try and do is normally you have a pretty good example of a small group of drivers who've been pretty much at the max of what they did at the weekend. So Verstappen, Russell, Gasly, Ocon were up there, and then you sort of had Tsunoda and Leclerc pushing in there. So you have a group at the top, and then you have a group at the bottom. So I've got Colapinto, Stroll, crashed in qualifying, off on the formation lap. Albon, crashed in qualifying, didn't start the race, even though he's quite quick. Sainz, crashing qualifying, crashing the race. Behrman, quite a lot of offs. So that sort of created a group of a few drivers at the top and a few drivers at the bottom. And then you have the problem of the middle is often really tight. I think I said on a recent members podcast that often the gap between 5th and 15th in the racing is pretty small because all of these drivers are really quite good. Even the worst Grand Prix drivers are operating at a very high level. So yes, that's sort of the methodology. And then I sort of shuffle people around and you start to think, okay, how do you separate them? Again, Ocon and Gasly were a good example there because I thought, well, Ocon finished ahead of Gasly, but then you take into account the dry performance, etc. Yeah, so you sort of shuffle them around, and there's not necessarily an initial draft, but I'll write an entry and go through a driver's race, and I'll sort of stick them roughly where I think they should be, and then shuffle them around, and then it's a case of trying to feed in certain things that you think influence or drop their performance, and it can be very, very difficult between some of these drivers. You know, you've got people like Norris, Piastri, Bottas, Lawson, all sort of in a similar kind of area. Ben K, Ed, going forward, are you required to handicap all British drivers with a minus score before the weekend to ensure your subconscious British bias doesn't hamper Verstappen's final scoring, irrespective of how he performed? Yes, that's playing on the constant British bias allegations. Everyone's got bias. Actually, I'm not sure I'm especially strong on nationality bias because I'm not a huge. I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of nationality. Generally, I think that's one of the joys of Formula One, actually. But you try and set bias aside, trying to take a serious approach to this. But of course, bias is very, very difficult to put aside. Everyone's got bias, even if it's not overt favoritism, because I'll have a certain thought about how good certain drivers are, and maybe drivers who I have low expectations of who overachieve get a better ride, perhaps. Or perhaps drivers I don't think are so good maybe get a tougher ride because I think, well, they did okay, but I don't think they're that good. It's very, very hard to work that out, which is why I try and benchmark drivers against each other. It's quite difficult to do, I would say. Everyone's got various biases. I never think it's quite as overt and simple as people think it is, though. But the one thing I know is that I know some drivers are aware of where I put them in the rankings, and I'm always going to be confronted with them at some point in the very near future. So I have to be able to answer my rankings just as anything I write or say could be picked up on. I'm not going to say drivers are waiting for my rankings and look at it because most of them probably couldn't give a damn. But yeah, you need to be able to stand by it. Thomas Knight, so the rankings done in isolation, or do you compare to what drivers' teammates managed in the same similar machinery? I feel Perez this weekend is lucky to be 12th, or was Max going to make anyone look average? Well, yeah, good Grand Prix driver alongside all-time great. I always factor that in. Perez benefited, I think, got a bit of a lift from at least keeping it out of the wall. After binning it in qualifying, his mechanics fixed the car just for a dozy drive into the gravel. Stroll feels too high even at 19. Yeah, maybe. Stroll going off on the formation lap is pretty terrible. The team did say they saw a spike in the rear brake pressure. There's a little bit of a question mark there, and then Albon's off of exactly what the cause is. At the moment, it looks like it was probably driver error, but I'm waiting for the team to go through everything, and I'll be hassling them to try and find out if there was anything there. So sometimes you learn things like that. Albon was talking about a brake problem all through qualifying, so maybe, but it could have just been drifted right a bit onto the white line and braked and went off. But yeah, Stroll driving into the gravel was a bit embarrassing. He did get told over the radio you can reverse, but yeah, he went forward. So yeah, you could argue Stroll should have been 20th ahead of Colapinto, but Colapinto went off under the safety car, didn't need to. So yeah, teammate benchmarking is important because all through the weekend you're looking for a signal for how good the car is, and by definition, the teammate is the best measure of that. Beyond that, you've got to kind of guess. There's lots of factors you bring into it. Teams will tell you things. You'll understand what limitations are. So you kind of get a little bit of a picture for it. And you get all sorts of threads of information that feed into it. But yeah, teammate benchmarking is important. Michael Grayless, how do you compare Joe to those that finished ahead of him? I know Behrman had a scrappy race, but he still managed to bring it home in 12th. For this reason, I find it hard to put Joe ahead of him, who was last of the finishes. Yes, well, Joe kept out of trouble. That was the mission for him. Bring the Sauber home, which is not always easy because it's a pretty tricky car. Joe had a pretty horrible weekend in terms of the way it played out. FP1, they basically put him on some setup experiments, which he didn't particularly want to do, but they wanted to do it. And that meant the car was pretty horrible. So he had a nightmare practice. Qualifying the car was pretty horrible as well. They had to make some suspension changes because it was just too stiff. He was even struggling to make the switch changes going down the straights because the car was reacting so much. And then they messed up the timing. He went out for his second run in SQ1. I don't think he'd have made it through anyway. But he asked several times, how am I on time? How am I on time? How am I on time? And he kept saying, yeah, you got time in hand, time in hand, time in hand. He eventually realised, because he saw a big screen with a clock on it, that he was in trouble. But the team just didn't. So there are lots of things in the weekend that went against Joe ultimately. He was a little bit unlucky maybe in qualifying. He wasn't super quick by any stretch of the imagination. But I thought there are a lot of things holding him back, not least the fact he was in a Sauber. And yeah, he got home. He didn't go off a huge amount. I haven't watched all of Joe's race. That's the other thing I always try and stick the onboards on during the week and sort of work my way through, because there may be things there that I didn't see. But maybe there's a bit of a sympathy vote. Wasn't super quick, but lots and lots going against him, as has often been the case this year. Simon Ems, how do you actually do a driver rankings? Is it start somewhere and work out who's better or worse until you're happy, or something more esoteric? Yeah. It is kind of that who's better or worse, because you can iterate through it. You can think, oh, got Bottas 9th and Alonso 11th. Well, actually, I think Alonso is a bit better than Bottas. And you think, Lawson's between them. So you can kind of benchmark everyone against everyone. Very, very inexact science, unfortunately. It's just it's just tricky to get it precisely right because everybody's got different circumstances. Stranded colour work. How was navigating Alonso's ranking given his radio message about the mechanics? Yes, I had some sympathy for Alonso because I was a bit suspicious he might have been being a bit performative there over the radio, but I saw him. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the footage of him getting out of the car very gingerly. I saw him a couple of times after the race, once walking past with his helmet on. He was clearly not moving well. And then later, when he came to talk to TV and us, you could see he looked very drawn. He was already ill going into the weekend. He was holding himself weirdly. So there was a bit of a sympathy vote for Alonso. The team did feel there was a genuine braking problem as well, which led to his off. So a bit of sympathy there, and he's in Aston Martin, which was struggling. Now, what else have we got? So I've done Alonso. Mies says, is it possible to give Stroll a negative ranking because going off is one thing, but driving straight into the gravel? Yeah, I know. It's not ideal. Visibility's poor in that. He should have probably known there was gravel there. Should have reversed. Perhaps 20th would have been fairer for him. But yeah, that's what I'd call a catastrophic mistake. And there were basically three drivers who made catastrophic mistakes: Albon, Stroll, and Colapinto. You could have argued them in any order. Probably Albon would always be the top of them because he was very quick, actually. Very, very quick. Stroll got a bit of a benefit because he did make Q3. Yes, he crashed in Q2, and that helped him make Q3. But that Aston wasn't a great car. So he did show some decent pace in the wet. So I think that helped him a bit with Colapinto. OC, this weekend must have been such a mammoth task. I thought the rankings article might be into instalments. Yes, or I see one of my colleagues at the races replied that I've apologised for how long it was taking. Yeah, these races are more complicated. You get a race like Mexico, it's pretty straightforward. And obviously during races, I'm trying to follow absolutely everyone. I'm taking in loads of timing data and noting it down, trying to keep an eye on the main feed to note down incidents and that kind of thing. But it's very easy in a race like that to lose track of things, and you've got a limited time to go through everything. So you're trying to take in everything drivers have said on record, anything you've been told off record by teams. You try and get as much information as you can to balance all that together. You've got to remember what happened in the sprint elements and factor that in. You've got a chaos race, loads of stuff happened. You've got luck factoring into things. Interesting example there was probably George Russell, because originally I did quite late on have Verstappen, Gasly, Ocon as the top three. Once I decided Gasly had to be above Ocon, but then I thought, well, Russell, look at how well what more could he have done? He was pushing to stay out, which would have been the right decision. So he did well as well. So you had to sort of think, do you know what? I think Russell was very strong. Look how bad Hamilton was. So that gave Russell a bit of a late bump. And then you get drivers like Tsunoda. He made the right call under the safety car. The team was telling him to stay out under that virtual safety car. He said, no, wets, come in for wets. Pitted for wets, right decision. But you have this strange thing where the right decision and conditions was go to wets. A few drivers did that. Lawson was another one. But actually the right decision was to stay out because there was likely to be a red flag. So how do you balance it? I thought Tsunoda did pretty well, but he ended up down in fifth. He did lose a place to Ocon just before the VSC. So yeah, it is quite a mammoth task. I'm never absolutely delighted with the rankings. I just keep having to move them around until I think, well, I'm going to have to send them now. That's about right. But I can guarantee I'll find out things that might have slightly changed things overall. It is difficult to judge everyone because they're all doing slightly different things. They have slightly different challenges. How good was the McLaren? Great in the wet, brake locking troubles in the dry. It could be that actually Lando Norris did a really great job only to go off twice, but he did go off twice, so that cost him a bit, but he'd gone well in other elements. So yeah, very, very tricky. I could easily spend days sitting there endlessly shuffling it. In my ideal world, I'd watch every single lap in qualifying and the race on board. Don't have time to do that. Have to take some shortcuts and use some heuristics, and that's the outcome. I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea. I've gone on a bit longer than I intended. Hope I wasn't too rambling. We're going to try and keep doing this. I like the questions. I like being challenged on stuff. I've got no problem with people saying I disagree. The only thing I'll request is in future, everyone was good in those questions there, but if you say, I disagree with that, give a counter argument rather than just, there's bias in it. Nobody's done that, but it's really great if someone has a different perspective. And sometimes people have different perspectives in terms of what they prioritize. You could excuse mistakes, and people weight mistakes differently. I know from my experience working with Mark Hughes on and off over the years, when it comes to our top 10 rankings, he doesn't punish mistakes quite as much as maybe I do. But I tend to think that, well, the one thing is you've got to get through the weekend and not ruin things. And because everyone's operating at such a high level, mistakes do tend to be overpowered. But I've had people in the past give feedback saying, oh, this is ridiculous. You just made one mistake and everything else was great. It's like, well, yeah, but that one mistake can cost you. So I hope we can keep doing this. Thanks very much for sending in your questions and your challenges. And also, it'll help me refine the rankings. I'd like to hear different perspectives on how you do things, because maybe that'll give me ideas, because there's no scientific formula you can apply to it. They tried to do that for F1 with power rankings, and that's laudable, but it's very difficult because everybody has got a different mission. Take Verstappen passing Ocon. Ocon couldn't afford to clash with Verstappen. He didn't need to fight off the inevitable. If that was Lando Norris and he'd let someone through that Taney, that would be a terrible thing to have done in battle. So different drivers, different challenges. I'll stop now. Thank you very much, and maybe see you after Las Vegas for more questions.